Well, thank you all for coming to our event today. It is really a pleasure to have with us not just our current speakers, but John Chipman, our Director General and Chief Executive, is visiting from London today, so we've got a full house of our ISS team. The occasion is the launch of this of our latest Adelphi book, or near latest Adelphi book, Drugs, Insecurity in Failed States, The Problems of Prohibition. The authors of the book are my colleagues Nigel Inkster, who many of you know as the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk at the IISS. He is one of Britain's top intelligence professionals. He served in the British Secret Intelligence Service from 1975 to 2006, including as Assistant Chief and Director for Operations and Intelligence. He's a graduate of St. John's College in Oxford with a degree in Oriental Studies. Welcome back. And I think on our first visit to the Washington office, is that correct? Ms. Virginia Comolli. She is a research analyst in the Transnational Threat and Political Risk Program. And she previously worked as an analyst in the private security sector. She received her master's degree in intelligence and strategic studies at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. So it's a pleasure to have you both here. I had thought the title of the book up until I received it was Drugs and Thugs, which is, we refer to it internally, but we have a more descriptive, if not as exciting title of Drugs, Insecurity in Failed State. But the analysis is what it is, and I think you'll benefit from hearing Nigel and Virginia talk about it. Books are on sale for those of you who aren't IISS members and don't receive your Adelphi books. You can purchase these after the program. So Nigel, Virginia, welcome. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much for taking the time to come this afternoon. It's always very fun and very stimulating to be in Washington, D.C. I seem to be making something of a habit of coming here in March to launch products. We did the FARC dossier last year. Actually, one of our most pressing difficulties was to find an appropriate title for the book, because some of the more attractive ones, Shooting Up, Drugs and Thugs, had already been taken. So we decided that we would try and be a little bit more literal. And I think there were a few people within our IISS who felt that this was a book that had needed to be written for some time, but a lot of other more immediately salient issues I think that pushed it down the agenda. But a number of things changed to bring it back up to the top of our preoccupations in the Transnational Threats Program. Firstly, simple empirical observation of conflicts around the world, which we routinely monitor through our armed conflict database, suggested that narcotics-fueled violence was becoming more of an issue and something that started to look as if it might have a strategic dimension. And that was brought home by some very public pronouncements by senior figures in parts of the world affected by this violence, and particularly in Central and South America. We also saw in the United Kingdom a series of events, including the forced resignation of a Home Office advisor on drugs who had queried whether the UK's existing drugs policy could credibly be seen as evidence and science-based. And that, to our minds, highlighted what seemed a growing disconnect between how the issue of drugs was perceived in consumer and producer countries, and very different preoccupations. And finally, we've had some interesting conversations with some people in in the drugs rehabilitation field who complained about the fact that the domestic debate on drugs, certainly within the UK and to a degree elsewhere, had become stalled, and we're wondering if there was a different way to approach the issue. And after we looked through the available literature, we decided that there was now a place for a book that looked at drugs primarily from the perspective of producer and transit states, with a particular focus on the national and human security implications of the trade. It seemed to us to be a useful way of reframing what had become a very intractable issue. And it also sits very well with the IISS mission statement, which, just to remind you, is briefly as follows: to conduct research, analysis and debate on the problems of conflict, however caused, that have or potentially have a significant military content. IISS aims to provide, through publications and other activities, the best possible analysis of the policies to be pursued by government and other actors to further and maintain international peace and security. It also aims through these activities to influence and promote the adoption of sound policies to maintain and further international peace and security and civilized international relations by all actors able to realize these objectives. Here ends the lesson. In a world where armed conflict between states has become something of a rarity, and even civil wars have declined dramatically in incidence, there is this one notable exception, and this is the phenomenon of narcotics-related violence. And before taking this any further, I think we do have to recognize, firstly, that narcotics are not the only commodity that has fueled violence, insecurity, and criminality in the developing world. There are many other commodities which have had this effect. But narcotics, and in particular heroin and cocaine, which are the primary focus of this book, have played, we think, a unique role due to the markup that they command from factory gate to retail distribution, a markup of many 1,000% in terms of their value. And of course, the reason they command this enormous value is a direct result of the existing global policy, which is based on prohibition. They're also of particular salience because of, firstly, the ease with which they can be cultivated, and by virtue of what one scholar has termed their low obstructability. There is almost no limit to the routes and the concealment techniques that can be used to smuggle drugs, and law enforcement pressure on one route or one concealment technique simply displaces activities somewhere else. I think it's also worth saying, point two, it's seldom if ever the case that drugs are in and of themselves responsible for causing violence. Of the cases that we examine in detail in the book, which are Colombia, Afghanistan, and Central America, had all had long experience of violence predating their involvement with the drugs trade. In the case of West Africa, the factors which have enabled narcotics traffickers to corrupt and subvert entire nation states also predated the arrival of the drugs trade. But for the reasons just set out, drugs have enabled a range of powerful actors who have become, to use a phrase coined by my colleague at IISS, General H.R. McMaster, stakeholders in state weakness. People who are part of the state or benefit from the state, but actively wish that state to be weak in order to maximize their own power base and revenue earning capabilities. And our book looks at the following areas: understanding why drugs like heroin and cocaine exercise the hold on us that they do. The problems of estimating the size of the global drugs trade, difficult given that it is by definition, it is illicit and by definition very difficult to encompass. The origins of the current prohibition-based system, the impact of the drugs trade on specific countries and regions, and it is worth noting, in parenthesis, that the number of countries affected by the drugs trade has grown significantly since the first international convention was signed in 1961. And finally, some thoughts on where we might go next with this issue. What we thought in this session we might do is concentrate as much as possible on looking at the impact and effectiveness of current narcotics policies and considering the implication of alternative approaches. assuming that we think there is a need to do that. But I think the first thing we need to do is to reflect on how we came to be where we are. When the movement for drugs prohibition began over 100 years ago, there were only two drugs that were cause for concern. One was opium and subsequently heroin, and the other one was cocaine. The drugs market was monopolized by nation states, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands. And it was assumed that if these states could be persuaded to cease production, problems of drug misuse would largely be resolved. And so we got a situation in which the United States was exercising significant pressure on colonial powers to cease the production of large quantities of these drugs, the revenue from which was actually used to administer the colonies in which production took place. Interesting to reflect that since then, not only has the number of problem drugs in the world increased substantially, but the global drugs market has now become the exclusive preserve of non-state actors, for whom the prohibition regime constitutes an enormous perverse incentive, as the United Nations Organization on Drugs and Crime has acknowledged. The launch of our book coincided with the recent Summit of the Americas, which was the first time that drugs had a place on the agenda. And I'd like to be able to tell you that this was not a coincidence, but unfortunately you wouldn't believe me and you'd be right not to. It was pure dumb luck. But it was no coincidence that throughout the period during which our research was taking place, an increasing number of high-profile political actors began to talk publicly about the malign nexus between drugs and insecurity. And when somebody like Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos, a politician not known for an excessively liberal approach to law and order, talks publicly about a need for a rethink of global drugs policies, this suggests that something quite important is happening. I don't think Santos's observations were uniquely focused on narcotics. I think as much as anything he was sending a message to the United States government about the need to stay engaged in Colombia, but that's nonetheless I think interesting that he chose to phrase his comments, frame his debate in that context. And I think that is interesting, particularly because Colombia has been presented as a kind of poster boy of how a counter-narcotics campaign in a developing country should be conducted and fought. And there's no doubt, and I speak as somebody who's been engaged in Colombia for the last 15 years, including on counter-narcotics work, that the country has registered significant progress in terms of reducing the problem of narcotics-fueled violence from something which threatened the stability of the state to an issue that can increasingly be looked at as a law and order issue. But the cost that Colombia has incurred in terms of deaths, injuries, internally displaced populations, and economic opportunity costs, development opportunities foregone, have been enormous. And of course, meanwhile, the amount of cocaine produced within Colombia, to the extent that we can calculate that, which frankly is little more than inspired guesswork, has not significantly diminished over the last few years, and to the extent that it has reduced, it's more than compensated for by an increase in production in Peru and other parts of the Andes. And meanwhile, of course, in Afghanistan, which has now become the world's monopoly supplier of heroin, accounting for 85% of total global supply, the problem of drugs has been recognized certainly by UK officials as a generational problem, which the projected NATO ISAF drawdown seems likely only to exacerbate in the short term. I think it's interesting to reflect that in very few days we have the Chicago NATO summit taking place, and it's not clear to me that drugs will even be on the formal agenda of that summit. They'll certainly be talked about in the margins of the discussion. but it is quite clear that as things stand, we really just don't know what to do about drugs. And experience over the last decade in Afghanistan has suggested that counter-insurgency and counter-narcotics policies do not work well when conducted simultaneously. That the imperative to achieve security before you can make meaningful progress on counter-narcotics, I think, is becoming pretty well established. And we know what it costs, more or less, to pursue the policies that we're currently pursuing to deal with drugs. We can put a price tag on many of these activities, whether in the form of domestic law enforcement and correctional activities allocated to dealing with drugs in consumer countries, or in the form of insecurity, poor governance, and environmental degradation in producer and transit states. Some other costs: marginalization and stigmatization of problem drug users, harder to assess, but I think we can still have a stab at it. But what is much harder to do is to assess the costs and likely implications of alternative approaches, not least because such approaches are bound to have unforeseen consequences, just as our existing policies have done. And meanwhile, any attempt to move to a new approach will have to contend with entrenched opposition from powerful constituencies with stakes in the status quo, and we shouldn't underestimate the barriers to change, either at a national level or below that. But assuming that the costs of the status quo begin to look unacceptably high, or just acceptable from a moral and ethical perspective, in terms of the developed world making the developing world pay the price for its consumer choices, what might change actually look like? What could we do that might be different? And firstly, I think we would argue that the issue of drugs misuse needs to be reframed, to be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as an issue to be managed, and managed in a way that creates minimal collateral damage. Year after year, the international community reports back to itself, announcing that it has failed to meet the objectives it has set itself, and that it will then continue with the same policies that have brought about this failure. In 1998, the United Nations General Assembly Special Session, UNGAS, pledged to bring about a drugs-free world within a decade. In 2008, by which time levels of drug production and use had not notably declined, and the problems of violence and insecurity associated with the drugs trade had got palpably worse, UNGAS gave itself another decade to achieve its objectives. Now, I'm not saying this, to suggest that the international community, are a bunch of idiots, don't know what they're doing. I mean, I'm not for one moment suggesting that. But the fact is, I think we have rather got stuck in a groove here, and that can happen. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is that the corollary to a drugs-free world was to be a world in which adequate supplies of drugs for illicit medical purposes become available to all those who need them. And we are very, very far indeed from achieving this objective, with the exception of about a dozen developed Western economies. Very few other countries are able to provide late-stage patients and others requiring palliative care with anything that we would recognize as adequate. Secondly, I think consumer countries can do a lot for themselves by moving from a penalization approach to the consumption of illicit drugs to one that is based on a more explicitly public health approach. And to some extent we're preaching to the converted here, because this is already starting to happen to a significant degree. And I would refer you, if you hadn't already read it, to a speech given by the US drug czar Gil Kerlikovsky about a week ago, where he was talking very much in these terms. And this is something that actually the conventions recognize as an acceptable approach, and one which ironically was at the heart of Richard M. Nixon's domestic policies when he launched his counter-narcotic strategy, since traduced as the war on drugs, in 1971. Nixon's vision was that much of the funding that he got from Congress to address this problem would actually be devoted to the healthcare aspects of narcotics use. And that is simply not what subsequently happened. And there is a respectable body of theoretical research, including from reputable entities like the RAND Corporation, suggesting that a public health approach to drugs is both more effective and more cost-effective than any other. And Portugal's counter-narcotics experiment over the last decade, which we go into in some detail in the book, would tend to vindicate this proposition. In this context, it would be helpful if the international community and key states within it were prepared to accept some greater degree of subsidiarity than currently exists in the way that the international conventions are applied. And by this what we mean is, while obviously requiring all states to subscribe to the aims of the treaties that they've signed up to, giving them more leeway to interpret the conventions in the light of their own particular circumstances and to apply policies best suited to their needs. I don't know if there is actually anybody here in the State Department present, but we really do think it's time that the State Department abolished its knee-jerk response to so-called harms reduction policies proposed by other states, not least given that some of these harm reduction policies are now actually being carried out in the United States with federal government endorsement, things like needle exchange programs. And maintenance doses of heroin. And I think it's also time that we address the misuse of particular drugs rather than lumping them together in some very broad categories, which ignore the very different impacts that these substances have on the people who consume them. Well, this is already starting to happen to some degree, but of itself, it may make life easier for consumer states, and certainly a lot easier on problem drugs users. But we have to accept that this alone is not going to alleviate the problems that we highlight in our book of criminality and instability caused by a criminal black market. Even if we did move to a broad public health approach to drugs misuse, there would still be a black market for drugs, and it would still be dominated by organized criminal groups. And the logical response to this, as proposed by numerous advocacy groups, is to legalize drugs on the basis that this would collapse the black market, and with it the incentive to traffic substances whose value to a large extent is a function of their illegality. And advocacy groups who make this case seldom, if ever, argue for a free-for-all, but rather the opposite, a regime of strict government regulation with each substance being treated on its own merits or demerits, depending on how you look at it. And obviously the main objection to such a regime is the perceived risk of a significant spike in drugs use, which is kind of where we came in 100 years ago, where we did have exactly that problem of extensive and pervasive misuse of opiate-based drugs. And such a risk is even more of a concern in the developing world, where healthcare systems are clearly inadequate to cope with the problems they've got, never mind an increase in public health related problems of this kind. Now, against this, we should note that drugs use is subject to a range of factors that we don't, I think, entirely fully understand, and nebulous concepts like fashion play a role. The price elasticity of different drugs varies quite considerably. Such research as there is suggests, for example, that heroin is relatively price inelastic, whereas in the case of cocaine, if the price goes down, consumption probably does go up. And one has, the example of anti-smoking policies in the Western world over the last couple of decades to demonstrate how it might be possible to use a variety of legal and social pressures to marginalize the consumption of a particular substance. But this is an area that requires a lot more work. And the impact of legalization on levels of criminality, I think we need to be careful about making blithe assumptions that the evidence doesn't necessarily support. I think if, in the unlikely event of drugs becoming legalized, serious organized criminal groups would undoubtedly continue to traffic in other commodities, as they already do, and they would probably still try to work to subvert any regime that might be established. If we look, for example, at what happens with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms in this country, these are all legal commodities, but the United States government still needs a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to deal with a whole range of problem issues related to the sale and consumption of these commodities. But there is one area where I think a significant reduction in criminality would undoubtedly be achieved, and that is at both ends of the business. These are the areas which are very highly labor intensive, production and street retail. And I think that if it were ever possible to introduce a different kind of regime, most of the people involved at both ends of this trade would probably move out of criminality, because they are people who have neither the capability nor, frankly, the ambition to gravitate towards other forms of criminal activity. So I think that, there is a reasonable assumption that some at least of these would simply drop out of criminal activity. But in the absence of a really radical shift, and I think we are quite a long way away from being able to contemplate such a shift, and we're not necessarily advocating it in the book, we still have to address the problems arising from the drug trade as it is now. Producer and transit states who attempt to deal with their drugs trade, often, it has to be said, in response to extreme Western pressure, really do, it seems to us, deserve help from those pressing them to act. And if one looks at the example of countries like Mexico, like a country we only mentioned very tangentially in this book, Tajikistan, transit countries who have allowed themselves to become effectively complicit in the trade, these countries end up facing two choices. Either they continue to be complicit in the trade and allow their institutions to become comprehensively corrupted and taken over by narco-criminals, or they stage a fight back. Mexico, after many years of effectively symbiotic relationship with criminal groups, has staged a fight back with the dramatic results that we have been and are continuing to witness. Tajikistan, which has only just emerged from a brutal civil conflict, I would suggest is in no position to start taking on the criminal gangs that are trafficking drugs across its territory at the moment, though at some point in the future that may come. But in cases where countries are prepared to stage a fight back, it seems clear to us that help is needed, and it has to be said that that help has indeed been forthcoming. And we in the book give the US government some pretty good crits for the way it has addressed the issue in Colombia in particular, and to a lesser extent Latin American states. I recognize that Mexico for the USA presents a particular problem, because in Mexican eyes the United States is a country which has invaded it no fewer than 13 times and is El Gran Norte, and there are some political issues make things a lot more difficult for the USA to provide effective security and technical assistance, but these are not insurmountable, and it seems to me that they are starting to be surmounted. But it is important to bear in mind that assistance to states like Colombia, effective though this has undoubtedly been, has been focused almost exclusively on the security sector. It is only now, 30 years into this conflict, that Colombia has finally succeeded in achieving a free trade agreement with the United States of America, which in the long term has more prospect, I would argue, of addressing some of the security problems Colombia faces than many other things that have been provided. And there are some aspects of US counter-narcotics policies, notably aerial spraying, which have been both contentious and arguably counterproductive, to the point where I think it really does behove us to call for a strategic pause and stop and ask ourselves whether we really want to carry on doing this sort of thing. I accept that claims by narcotics groups that glyphosate and other chemicals cause all sorts of ailments represent special pleading, and in some cases research has demonstrated, to my view pretty convincingly, that these claims are not well founded. But if there is even a slight chance that the use of glyphosates can cause spontaneous abortions, as has been claimed, it does seem to me that there is a case to be made for stopping and waiting to see whether the science can clarify the issue. The other thing, of course, is that aerial spraying tends to hit those at the bottom of the pile, destroying narcotics at their lowest point of value, and also being heavily disruptive of communities who depend on narcotics production because they really have few, if any, viable alternatives, as is the case with a lot of farmers in Afghanistan at this juncture. But while some aspects of US counter-narcotics policies towards the developing world may have had their shortcomings, almost inevitably, we would also characterize the response of European countries who have interests in this matter, with the possible exception of the United Kingdom, as arguably having veered too far in the other direction by failing to be willing to address the security issues, to provide concrete assistance to countries like Colombia because of concerns about human rights abuses. And while such concerns are undoubtedly well founded, it's not clear to us that they are best addressed by standing censoriously aloof from the conflict. Anyway. In short, we think the time has come to look at counter-narcotics in the context of a wider international security and development agenda, rather than leaving the issue in the isolated silo which it currently tends to occupy, and to do what Colombia's President Santos has called for, which is to undertake a comprehensive re-evaluation of existing policies on the basis of empirical research and open debate, with no options automatically excluded. Donald Reagan, when reflecting on his experiences during the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, "Don't just do something, sit there." And I think it may be that the time has come for us to not just do things, but also to sit there and consider the costs and implications of what we are doing, and ask ourselves whether we are getting the best value for the resources we are expending, and whether we could get better traction on some of these issues by contemplating different approaches. And that, ultimately, is all we are advocating in this book. Thank you.
Okay, we'll open the floor to questions. And if you get my attention, I'll get the list going. If you could state your name and affiliation. And Nigel, I'm just going to start with one. When you look at the experience of Colombia, could you tell us the distinctions? And I know it's not going to be a hard and fast distinction between the success of, was it the success of a counter-narcotic strategy or counter-insurgency strategy? And how do you disentangle those for your analysis?
It's very difficult to disentangle them because, of course, there were two plans in Colombia, in respect to Colombia. There was Plan Colombia and Plan Patriota. Plan Colombia was mainly focused on narcotics trafficking. Plan Patriota was more in the nature of a conventional, classic counterinsurgency policy that was deployed against an insurgency deriving a very substantial portion of its revenue from narcotics, and which was engaged in every facet of the trade. The two plans ran coterminously for a period. They overlapped, and of course they involved the deploying of some resources, similar resources against different targets. I think that for both the USA and the UK, it was quite difficult to justify politically becoming involved in Colombia's counterinsurgency, but counter-narcotics did offer, a way in that was legitimate and necessary. And of course, Colombia has had a number of different problems in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and even up to the present day. It has suffered from insecurity generated by cartels who had no ideological purpose, were simply interested in selling as many drugs as they could, but were prepared to varying degrees to defend their equities with the use of extensive violence. We saw this particularly in the 1980s with Carlos Escobar, the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel. Since then, what we've seen is a gradual reduction in the size of the cartels, greater specialization. The Escobar cartel was involved in every facet of the drugs trade. They had teams of accountants. They had MBAs from Harvard, telling them how to, manage the trade, and they also, had a very sophisticated and extensive counterintelligence effort focused against the Colombian government and its helpers, particularly the USA. Now, some of this, of course, is overlapped because, in Colombia, there's often debate about whether FARC is a insurgency, a terrorist organization, or a narco-trafficking organization. And of course, the FARC is actually all three things, and it's it has evolved. In the 1980s, FARC was very reluctant to get involved in the narcotics trade, and argued from ideological perspectives that it shouldn't do so. Not long afterwards, it was deeply implicated in all aspects of the trade. So you're right; it is very difficult to separate out the different components. I think it was possible to focus on the, if you like, professional narcotics traffickers who were organized in gangs and hence susceptible to intelligence pressures, and that one could target, bring down the leaders of these cartels, break them down into smaller components. That was something that was relatively easy to do, relatively easy to justify. We had no problems with that. Dealing with FARC, of course, a different problem. But essentially, one ended up using many of the same techniques, and the successes that the Colombian government have had against FARC have been very much intelligence-led successes.
The floor is open. Yes.
I'm John McGaffin, former senior CIA operations officer and senior advisor to the director or deputy director of the FBI. Two sort of questions of fact to me. One, you said that the Nixon drug program the idea was the majority of the funds would be available for health and health-related issues. This didn't happen. Why didn't that happen? What were the factors? I think that germane to our discussion today in another way. And the second one, sort of, you said that there are dramatic results from the Mexican fight back. How would you certainly say that the violence is dramatic. What are the, you didn't say they're all positive,
Yeah.
so dramatic results, but would you sort of help me think through what those are?
Okay, well, I think the first one, what happened quite simply was that America went down the penalization route with drugs, that essentially instead of treating addicts and problem drug users, it simply started locking them up, and that has simply become more an element of US domestic drugs policy, which particularly became evident in the 1980s when we saw this massive epidemic of crack cocaine in US inner cities.
So before that, then a switch to the Coast Guard, the military, the intelligence, and everything else.
Well, I mean, the external aspects, the external, the supply control aspects of Nixon's policies were always, going to be dedicated to those ends. It was, the domestic component of the budget, which he had initially envisaged as being very much focused on healthcare and rehabilitation, ended up being spent on basically locking people up. On the Mexican fight back, I mean, I was really talking, when I said dramatic, I was thinking about the violence. 49 dead bodies in Laredo last weekend, severed heads being, rolled onto the floors of discotheques, and ever more baroque execution methods being deployed. I mean, I do think that Mexico is starting to stage a more effective fight back. It's really, after years of saying that Colombia had nothing to teach yet, it is now quietly acknowledged that actually the Colombian experience is one they need to emulate, particularly in terms of establishing islands of relative uncorruptibility in this sea of corruption that we have been witnessing. And I think both of us have seen how in Colombia that that has to be done. You create dedicated police units whose in whom you can develop some trust, and then from there you have to develop elements of the judiciary who are similarly vetted and trusted, and so you expand out from there, and you hope that over time those behaviours will attach themselves more to the mainstream of the government, which they do, to some degree when things go well. Well, the Mexicans are now starting to do that. They've got a federal police, which is one of their biggest problems in the past. Not having a federal police, because with all these little police forces around the country, the narcos were just able to, buy them, pick them off, play them one against the other. So some things are starting to happen, and they do have a plan. And it's basically broadly the same plan that Colombia's got.
Yeah, if we can add, I think when President Calderon came to office, he really launched a war against the cartels, and that meant that very quickly up to 50,000 soldiers were deployed alongside the police to fight the cartels. One of the most dramatic effects that Nigel was alluding to is really the fragmentation of the cartels, because one of the goals were to change the threat from a national level threat to a more localized one, for one that could be more easily contained and eventually eliminated. This unfortunately did not happen, because yes, the fragmentation of the cartels took place, but this translated into violence that was very unpredictable and decentralized, and so it was very hard for the armed forces and for the police to really target the cartels and predict where they would strike next. And absolutely, as Nigel said, I think Mexico is one of the countries with the most fragmented police forces that you could never find in the world, really, of the national level, federal level, municipal level, and I think coordination is very hard, and also levels of drug cartels and infiltration within the police also are very hard. However, this current administration, and starting also from the previous two, they've started to introduce police reform, which of course will take quite a lot of time. And also the most recent strategy that Nigel mentioned within Mexico, I think is no longer just law enforcement and the army. There are also programs put in place that look at development and education and employment opportunities, which are very important because if people get legal jobs, they are less likely to join criminality.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm David Borden with the organization StopTheDrugWar.org and the Drug War Chronicle newsletter. My question is on the issue of the issue raised of unavailability of palliative care opioid medications in much of the world. Is this a simple economic issue, what developing nations can afford to spend on health care, or is this fallout from regulatory controls in the prohibition regime on the global illicit production of opium and where and how it can be shipped?
It's quite a complex phenomenon, I think. It has all the elements that you just listed. A large part of it is just plain economic. The ability of countries to set up systems that would be able to manage programs of palliative care that you need some basic infrastructure and organizational structure in place in order to do this, and a lot of countries simply do not now have that. But there is also a significant ideological component to it. I mean, for example, there are countries in Africa who will not countenance the use of drugs such as heroin and morphine for palliative care because of the perceived risk of addiction taking hold. Now, if I was suffering from late-stage liver cancer, I'm not sure that addiction to opiates would be that high on my personal risk register, but there are a number of countries, and notably I think in Africa, where there is a kind of ideological stroke, moral, I'd say perhaps moralistic rather than moral component to this. So it is quite difficult. I mean, where medical opiates are produced, we talk about this in the book. The preferred method of doing it is so-called opium straw, which is rather than bleed the bulbs and take the sap, you simply harvest the poppy and crush it, and you can do this on an industrial scale. A couple of guys with combine harvesters can do this very quickly, and of course that is what has driven the international economics of the thing. The only distinction I can think of at the moment is the US purchase of medical morphine from India, where basically the USA has taken a political decision to pay significantly over the odds for Indian morphine, which is collected using traditional techniques, bleeding the bulb. Now, if one were to apply that to Afghanistan, obviously the cost of producing morphine for and heroin for medical palliative care, even assuming that the security situation would allow it, which it manifestly does not, are in current circumstances questionable.
Question in the back, yes.
Sam Ho-Tree, Institute for Policy Studies.
Hi, Sam.
Hi. Nigel, could you talk about the response you've received to this report, without naming names unless you're free to do so, in terms of both official, private versus public responses, and is there a great contrast between that discourse?
We haven't, Sanho, set about systematically collecting responses yet, I think it's fair to say. My subjective impression is that by and large the response to this book has been pretty favourable. I'm not aware that we've had too much in the way of adverse comment. Virginia?
No. Yes, I think that's true. Of course, when we launched the book in London, first we did a few articles in newspapers, and some journalists really capitalized on Nigel's former job, and as a former senior's book says, legalized drugs. That's not what we're saying. And then if you read the commentary or the comments posted at the bottom of the article, people say, oh yes, what's next? Are we going to legalize rape and murder? So of course you have some people who still think that way, and they don't really take the time to really understand what we are trying to say in the book, which is not outright legalization. But I think what I've noticed over the past few months, especially in London, where I'm based, is that people are more open to discuss this issue, and there have been a number of events organized by different organizations, and not just the usual suspects of the people who would normally work on drug policy reform, and just people from security organizations, not just us. And I think a big driver has been the Colombian ambassador in London, who's a spokesperson for President Santos, is really keen on bringing people from different constituencies just to discuss the options and start the discussion afresh without coming to the table saying this is the right answer. Let's just do the research, look at the facts, let's leave emotions out and just let's see what we come up with.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll be monitoring this, over the next few months, and not least because if we are going to do follow-up work, and we are busy thinking about various directions that such follow-up work might take, and obviously it would be helpful to take some of this commentary, into account. But certainly, what we haven't had, is a rash of negative, commentary of the have IISS taken leave of their senses, but I've seen very little, if any, of that.
Yes. Right here.
Eric Mota, Global Security Studies.
Yeah.
Eric Mota, Global Security Studies, Johns Hopkins University. My question is, what will happen if drugs are legalized in drug transit countries and not in consumer countries? I mean, transnational criminal organizations are using transit states as platforms to launch their operations. Therefore, can we expect a significant reduction in violence if this commodity is legalized in transit states?
You want to take that one?
So yes, well, I think, okay, levels of violence in transit countries vary considerably. I mean, we have the example of Mexico and Central American countries where the levels of violence are very, very high, as we know from the reports in the newspapers. There are regions such as West Africa where the levels of drug-related violence are generally pretty contained. There are a few examples of sustained violence, but more or less. So often the gangs are not even armed. So that's you can't group them all together. I think that legalizing drugs in general would not necessarily eliminate or reduce crime. I think that's something we have to live with. We have seen that criminal organizations have already diversified their business models. They don't simply deal with drugs, they deal with other commodities. They also are involved in prostitution, racketeering, money laundering, and all of that. And that is not going to disappear even if we legalize drugs. So competition for the markets is going to continue, and it's probably going to become even more violent if the commodities they're trading with are fewer.
And I think the conventional wisdom on legalization has always been that you'd have to do it on a global basis, to have any prospect of making it work. And I think that this is one of the things that is perhaps most off-putting to policymakers when they look at an issue like this. I have to confess that I'm not sure what I think on this point, but I'm not entirely convinced that we would necessarily have to have a commitment to pan-global action in order to begin to make headway here. And there might be a case which we would need to staff up with very much more research and scenario planning than we have been able to do, which might look at some different ways of doing this, different sets of consequences in circumstances where parts of the world have legalized drugs, others have not, and try to model through what the potential implications of those different scenarios might look like.
Yes, Daniel Brito with Drug Policy Alliance. Kind of a follow-up to the first question.
I'm still unclear on what the, from the supporters of Plain Colombia, from their perspective, what the counter-narcotic success was in Colombia. Clearly, there was a counterinsurgency success against the FARC, even as the paramilitaries, who are narco-terrorists by any reasonable definition, have consolidated themselves into the Colombian political firmament. I heard you mention the breaking down of the size of the cartels, but what impact has that had, or could it ever possibly make in terms of the global drug market, particularly in light of the experience in Mexico, which was alluded to, in which the decapitation strategy actually, in the short term at the very least, has led to increased violence?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that it's done very little to reduce levels of cocaine being trafficked out of Colombia. The real purpose of this exercise was not in the expectation that it would bring about an end to cocaine trafficking and production in Colombia. This was about breaking down a problem that had at one point assumed existential dimensions for the security of the Colombian state into something which could be addressed as a law and order problem. We saw in the 1980s Pablo Escobar taking on the Colombian state in a full frontal armed confrontation. That was, okay. Since that point, I think most of the cartels learnt the lesson that taking on the state full frontal was not a good idea. But the cartels that replaced the 1980s generation, people like groups like Norte del Valle, were still enormously large and powerful organizations. They talked about boutique cartels, and I can't think of a less appropriate term to describe some of these organizations. There's nothing boutique about $124 million worth of cocaine trafficked in 1 year. So these were still very, very powerful groups, and I think the aim of the strategy was to break them down into smaller entities that could be more easily policed, and which didn't constitute a significant threat to national security and stability. It wasn't really about eliminating flows of cocaine from Colombia, or at least that was not ever the way that I saw it when I was involved in such activities myself.
Nigel, Ron Marks, Focus at GW, Homeland Security Policy Institute. I was just a little curious. We talk a lot about the demand on the supply side. The supply side here, but let's talk about the demand side a little bit too. One of the, you've seen our policy in the United States has gone like a bad driver, left to the right of the road in terms of how we approach it. But mostly it's been an enforcement strategy, and mostly it's been one of penalty. I guess the question I would ask you in terms of modeling or your own thinking ahead is, if there were legalization of some of these drugs within the U.S., the counter argument has always been that there would be an increase in addiction here, that there would be increased costs here. Have you thought about that a little bit, or modeled that out a little bit in terms of your thinking?
We have not. We don't really have the capacity to do that. We've cited some of the work that has been done by others. The problem is a lot. I mean, as you know, a lot of this is fairly dense economic theory, which doesn't make itself readily accessible to policymakers. So we've tried to strip some of the complexity out and set out the basic conclusions from some of this research. I mean, the short answer is, of course, we don't know, and this is the problem where those arguing for the status quo will invariably deploy the counterfactual argument that if we didn't do what we were doing, the problems of drug misuse around the globe would be so much worse than they are. But of course, the problem with the counterfactual is, by definition, you can't prove it. So we have that problem. I mean, I think intuitively, yes, one senses that that this would be the case for some drugs, but perhaps not others. It's not perhaps clear to me, for example, that heroin, which tends to be the province of people who are almost by definition problem users of some problem people of some kind, people with problems that go beyond, for which heroin consumption tends to be a symptom of a wider malaise, would necessarily increase that greatly in number. I mean, it's very difficult. One of the big problems the USA's got at the moment is iatrogenic addiction to prescription painkillers and antidepressants, which suggests that the US medical establishment is in need of some fairly urgent remedial education here. And I note that there are one or two schools in America now that are starting to have specialized courses in addiction management, which I think is to be encouraged. This is a very complex issue and needs more work, more resources than it has acquired. Now, those advocating legalization will say one can simply take all the costs of correctional and law enforcement activity and make a virtual net transfer to healthcare and related approaches, and I don't think that's likely to be true. My experience of government is that things are seldom, if ever, this simple. So I don't think that will be the case. I mean, U.S. correctional policies are not just determined by narcotics. I know that this tends to be rather, reduced, to bumper sticker oversimplification in Europe, where the discourse is that a large number of people are in American jails for no better reason than they have been found in possession of drugs. Well, actually, a lot of that is explained by a plea bargaining system that gets people much lighter sentences than they otherwise might deserve. So it is all a lot more complicated than that. But actually, I think experience elsewhere suggests that it might be possible to have a healthcare approach that would be able to manage some of these problems without being ruinously expensive. In the United Kingdom, prior to the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, it was possible for heroin users to register with their general practitioners and get maintenance doses of heroin. Nobody thought there was, that was particularly difficult, and it sure as hell isn't expensive, because the heroin intrinsically is not expensive. It's not an expensive thing to produce. So, there are ways one can manage some of, some aspects of this. The other thing is that, I was reading the other day a report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons about a particular prison in the United Kingdom. It was actually Durham, as I recall, which revealed that 13% of the inmates of this prison who had not had a drugs problem when they entered prison had one when they left. Now, what does this tell us about the nexus between drugs and the correctional establishment? It's a one commodity that people in jail seem to have no difficulty getting hold of. For what it's worth, my personal view is that putting people in jail for quite a wide range of offences doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly if you take into account the loss of productive economic activity that ensues as a result. So there are all sorts of costs here coming at you from all sorts of directions. I mean, I'm not suggesting that there is a simple panacea here by any means, but I do feel that actually we could probably save quite a lot of costs by, or at least let me put it this way, that the cost of transiting from a penal base to a healthcare system could conceivably be cost neutral. It might actually be a little bit better. There was one study done recently that we cited in this book, which suggested that if you tax these, if you take into account the cost of the current system, take into account the costs of the benefits to the government of taxing all these drugs in a legalized regime, the Treasury would coin it in big time, and all your problems would be over. And I don't think that's particularly helpful approach. I mean, I'm not decrying that research. We cite it in our book because I think it does have some broad utility. The system is not, as simple as they suggest by any means. But I think you could have a regime in which cost of healthcare could conceivably be contained, and to some degree possibly defrayed by a taxation system. It's not unimaginable.
I regret we've come to the end of our hour, in fact, I'm a little over, and I'd like to, with apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to, but with thanks to our speakers, Nigel Inkster, Virginia Comolli, thank you for your presentation, for your fantastic work on this book.
Can I just, before we finish, say that I'm very remiss in not having expressed my thanks to the Open Society Foundation, who funded this project, and who have been absolutely the best source of support we could ever have imagined. They've been extremely generous, they've been extremely helpful, and they have been meticulous in not seeking to interfere with or influence the outcome of our researches and deliberations. So many thanks to them.